a Mascot. The police officer, a man with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie, told me that whoever he was likely halfway to Nevada by now. He said transients move like dust in the wind, settling only long enough to cause a mess before blowing over to the next town. He told me to lock my doors, buy some pepper spray, and try to forget the face painted in grease and malice. But the police didn't see what I found in my ethics textbook this morning. They didn't see the single, crumpled Wendy's napkin pressed between pages 104 and 105. It wasn't just trash. In the center, stiff with dried brown fluid that I prayed was barbecue sauce, but knew was blood, was a drawn smile, a crude, jagged line that stretched too wide, mimicking the impossible anatomy of the thing I met that night. And the smell. God, the smell. It wasn't the scent of old paper or highlighter ink. It was the thick, cloying stench of stale fryer oil and unwashed skin, a scent that seems to cling to the back of my throat even now, hours after I burned the book in the dorm quad trash can. I know he isn't in Nevada. He's watching. He's waiting for the second course. It started with the kind of peer pressure that feels less like coercion and more like a slow, inevitable erosion of common sense. It was Halloween in Oak Creek, a town that existed solely to service the university and the endless cycle of students who treated the local geography like a disposable playground. I had planned to spend the night in my dorm shielded by noise-canceling headphones and a stack of sociology reading, but Sarah wouldn't hear of it. Sarah was the kind of friend who treated silence as a personal affront, a void that needed to be filled with bass drops and cheap vodka. She showed me the Snapchat invite, the screen glowing with neon text that promised the underground event of the century. It wasn't at a frat house or a bar. It was at the Black Pawn, a derelict structure on the edge of the industrial district that had been shuttered since the late 90s. There were rumors about the Black Pawn, of course. Every college town has that one building that serves as a lightning rod for urban legends, a place where the barrier between the mundane and the macabre is supposedly thin. The seniors whispered that the basement used to be an illegal gambling den where a student vanished 10 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a single shoe and a pool of blood that never dried. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I certainly didn't believe in the supernatural agency of brick and mortar, but I believed in structural instability and fire codes. The idea of cramming 300 sweaty bodies into a basement with one exit seemed like a statistical gamble I wasn't eager to take. Yet, looking at Sarah's pleading eyes and the already donned angel wings of her costume, I caved. I told myself it was just for an hour. I told myself that the anxiety coiling in my gut was just social awkwardness, not a premonition. That was the first lie of the night, the first brick in the wall of rationalization that would trap me later. The walk to the venue was biting cold, the October wind whipping through the streets of Oak Creek like a physical reprimand. Leaves skittered across the pavement, sounding like dry, bony fingers tapping against the asphalt. The town was alive, but in a disjointed, feverish way. We passed hordes of students dressed as superheroes, vampires, and memes that would be outdated by next week. Laughter echoed off the brick facades of the downtown shops, brittle and too loud, fueled by pre-game shots and the electric anticipation of a night without consequences. But as we moved away from the main drag and toward the industrial district, the crowds thinned. The street lights became sparse, flickering with an ominous irregularity that felt scripted by a B-movie director. The buildings here were hushed, their windows boarded up or staring blankly like hollow eye sockets. When we reached the Black Pawn, the bass was already vibrating through the soles of my boots. The building was an ugly, squat thing made of concrete and despair sitting beneath the shadow of a rusted water tower. There was no sign, just a heavy steel door propped open by a cinder block swallowing a line of students who descended into the darkness like offerings on a conveyor belt. The air around the entrance smelled of menthol cigarettes and damp earth. I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts screaming at me to turn around to go back to the safety of fluorescent dorm lights and deadlines. Sarah grabbed my hand, her grip tight and excited. "Come on, Maya," she shouted over the muffled thrum of the music. "Don't be a buzzkill. It's just a basement." We descended. The staircase was narrow, the wooden steps groaning under the weight of the crowd. The air grew heavier with each step, the temperature rising until it felt like walking into a fever dream. When we reached the bottom, the sensory assault was instantaneous and total. The space was cavernous, a concrete womb illuminated only by strobe lights that sliced through the haze of smoke and sweat. The music wasn't just loud, it was physical, a relentless pounding that rattled the teeth in my skull and disrupted the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was a sea of bodies, a writhing mass of synthetic fabrics and exposed skin, moving in a synchronized chaos that felt primitive. I lost Sarah within the first 5 minutes. One moment she was right beside me adjusting her halo, and the next she was swept away by a current of dancers disappearing into the strobe-lit fog. I was alone standing near a structural pillar that was peeling layers of lead paint, clutching my phone like a talisman. I checked for a signal, no service. Of course, we were 20 feet underground in a concrete bunker. We might as well have been on the moon. I decided to find the bar, or at least a corner where the air was breathable. I navigated through the crowd, muttering apologies that went unheard, dodging elbows and spilled drinks. The demographic of the party was off. That was the first thing that pricked at the back of my neck, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't immediately articulate. While most of the attendees were clearly students, fresh-faced, energetic, wearing costumes that prioritized aesthetics over warmth, there were others. Drifting through the crowd were figures that seemed harder weathered. Men in their 30s and 40s with calloused hands and eyes that didn't smile, standing near the edges of the room, nursing warm beers. They didn't look like they were there to party. They looked like sharks circling a reef, waiting for a fish to separate from the school. I told myself they were just locals, townies, crashing the college scene for free booze, a common enough occurrence in Oak Creek. I found a spot near the makeshift bar, a plank of wood set up on 2 stacked pallets serving cheap keg beer in red plastic cups. I didn't want to drink, but I needed a vantage point. I leaned against the damp concrete wall, trying to look like I was observing rather than hiding. That was when I saw him. He was standing in the center of the dance floor, yet he was completely motionless. In a room where everyone was in constant, frantic motion, his stillness was a violent aberration. He was like a rock in a river, the flow of people parting around him unconscious of his presence, yet instinctively avoiding contact. He was dressed as the Wendy's mascot. But it wasn't a costume you buy at a Spirit Halloween store. It wasn't a cheeky, sexy version worn by a sorority girl. It was a grotesque mockery of the icon. The dress was a faded, dirty blue, the fabric strained to its breaking point across a torso that was massive and doughy. Seams dug into his flesh, creating rolls of fat that bulged awkwardly, making the dress look less like clothing and more like a casing for a sausage that was about to burst. He wore a wig, 2 stiff, bright red pigtails that stuck out at unnatural angles, the synthetic hair matted and frizzy, resembling dead grass dyed in blood. But it was the face that made my stomach turn over. He hadn't used a mask. He had painted his face. A thick, uneven layer of white grease paint covered his skin, but it was melting under the heat of the basement. Rivulets of sweat carved tracks through the makeup, revealing the ruddy, pock-marked skin beneath. He had drawn freckles on his cheeks with a black marker, but they weren't cute dots. They were jagged, angry stabs of ink that looked like disease. His lips were painted a garish red, overdrawn to create a permanent frozen smile that didn't match the deadness of his eyes. And beneath that terrifying painted grin, a patchy gray-flecked beard pushed through the stubble, warring with the makeup, in a texture that looked abrasive and diseased. He didn't look like a person wearing a costume. He looked like a costume consuming a person. I couldn't look away. There's a specific biological alarm that rings when you see something that violates the natural order, the uncanny valley response that screams predator or corpse. He triggered both. He stood there holding a red cup that looked comically small in his massive hairy hand, and he was just staring. He wasn't looking at the DJ. He wasn't looking at the lights. He was scanning the faces of the girls dancing nearby his head, tracking them with the slow mechanical precision of a security camera. "Stop staring," I whispered to myself, turning my gaze to the floor. It's just some weirdo, probably an art student doing a performance piece on the grotesque nature of consumerism. It was a flimsy lie, but it was better than admitting that a monster was standing 20 feet away from me. I tried to focus on the music, on the beat, on anything other than the image of those painted, sweating cheeks. A few minutes passed. I checked my phone again, still no signal. The air was getting hotter, thick with the smell of vaporizers and body odor. I decided I needed to find Sarah and leave. This wasn't fun, this was an endurance test. I pushed off the wall and started to weave my way toward the back of the room, where I thought I saw her wings earlier. The crowd was denser now. I was shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the heat radiating off them like a furnace. I felt a hand brush my waist, then another bump against my shoulder. I kept my head down, muttering "excuse me," focused on the exit sign that glowed faintly green in the distance. I had to pass the bathroom area, a narrow corridor that smelled strongly of urine and cheap disinfectant. A line of girls waited there checking their makeup in compact mirrors, oblivious to the damp darkness around them. I squeezed past the line, trying to make myself as small as possible. That was when the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of the bathroom. It was something distinct, something that cut through the odors of sweat and alcohol with sickening clarity. It was the smell of old grease. Not fresh cooking oil, but the kind that has been used over and over again until it turns black and rancid, the smell of a fast food dumpster baking in the July sun. It was thick, savory in a nauseating way, and underlined by a sharp tang of unwashed biological filth. I stopped the scent, triggering a gag reflex. Before I could identify the source, a shadow fell over me. "Hey there, Patty." The voice was low, wet, and sounded like gravel grinding together in a mixer. It didn't come from behind me. It came from right beside my ear. I froze, every muscle in my body locked up. I slowly turned my head, praying that I was wrong, praying that it was just a coincidence. He was there. The Mascot. Up close, the reality of him was infinitely worse than the view from across the room. I could see the pores on his nose clogged with white paint and sweat. I could see the yellowing of his eyes, the sclera mapped with broken red veins. He loomed over me, his bulk blocking out the strobe lights, casting me in his personal shadow. He was unnaturally tall, or maybe just broad enough to blot out the world. I think you have the wrong person." I stammered, my voice sounding thin and pathetic over the pounding bass. "My name isn't Patty," he smiled. The skin around his eyes didn't crinkle. Only the mouth moved, the painted red lips stretching wide to reveal teeth that were crooked and stained the color of old corn. "No," he wheezed, leaning in closer. "You're Patty, cute, small, fresh meat." He wasn't shouting despite the noise. He was speaking in a register that seemed to vibrate directly into my skull. He raised his free hand, the one not holding the cup, and reached toward me. His fingers were thick sausages of flesh, tipped with nails that were bitten down to the quick and rimmed with black grime. He didn't grab me. He reached out and touched a lock of my hair. I flinched, pulling my head back, but he didn't let go. He rubbed the strands of hair between his thumb and forefinger, examining the texture as if checking the quality of silk. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He leaned forward, dipping his face toward my neck, and inhaled deeply. The sound of his inhalation was loud, a wet, rattling sniff that went on for seconds too long. I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin, damp and smelling of onions and rot. "You smell delicious," he murmured, the words vibrating against my collarbone. "Better than the others. You haven't been spoiled yet. No smoke, No cheap booze, just sweet. The way he said sweet didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a flavor profile. Get off me, I shoved him. It was a reaction born of pure panic. My hands pushed against his chest, and the sensation was horrifying. Under the blue dress, his chest felt hard, solid muscle wrapped in layers of soft fat. It was like pushing against the side of beef hanging in a freezer. He didn't stumble, he didn't even blink. He just rocked back slightly on his heels, absorbing the force of my push as if it were a toddler's tantrum. The hand in my hair released, but not before giving a sharp, playful tug. Feisty, he chuckled. The sound was dry, devoid of humor. I like them with a little kick. Makes the texture more interesting. I'm leaving, I said, my voice shaking, but louder this time. I tried to channel the anger that usually comes with being harassed, but it was drowned out by a primal reptilian fear. This wasn't a drunk frat boy getting handsy. This was something else. This was the feeling of being a rabbit realizing the shadow above it belongs to a hawk. Why rush? He took a step sideways, blocking my path to the main dance floor, corralling me toward the darker, narrower hallway that led to the bathrooms. The party is just starting, Patty. I can show you the VIP section. I have a kitchen back there. We can make something special. Move, I commanded, though I felt anything but commanding. I looked around, desperate for someone to notice. The line of girls by the bathroom was gone. A group of guys was passing by, laughing, clinking bottles. Hey, I yelled at them. Can you help me? One of the guys looked over, scanned the scene, me small and terrified, standing next to a giant man in a dress. He laughed. Whoa, nice costume, dude, freaky. He gave the mascot a thumbs up and kept walking. They thought it was a joke. They thought it was part of the show. The mascot looked at the guys, then back at me. He winked, a slow, deliberate closure of one eye that felt like a shutter clicking on a camera. See, he whispered, everyone loves a mascot. We bring joy. We bring sustenance. I realized then that logic wouldn't work. Social norms wouldn't work. This man wasn't operating within the social contract of a college party. He was operating on a different frequency, one where I was an object and he was the consumer. Fear has a specific taste, metallic and sharp, like licking a battery. And at that moment my mouth was full of it. I didn't wait for him to grab me again. I didn't wait for him to elaborate on what he meant by sustenance. I ducked under his arm, the smell of rancid grease washing over me one last time, choking me. I scrambled past him, my shoulder scraping against the rough concrete wall. Patty, he called out. He didn't chase me immediately. He just stood there in the corridor, turning slowly to watch me run. You can't skip the main course, it's rude. I burst into the main crowd, using my elbows as weapons, now uncaring of who I hit or what drinks I spilled. I needed air. I needed the sky. I needed to be anywhere but under that pawn shop with that thing. I forgot about Sarah. It was a selfish, terrible thought, but in that moment, survival was a singular noun. I pushed through a knot of people dressed as zombies, the irony lost on me, and saw the stairs. I practically clawed my way up the wooden steps, gasping for breath, my lungs burning from the smoke and the scream I was holding back. When I burst out of the steel door and onto the street, the cold air hit me like a slap, shocking and clarifying. I stumbled onto the pavement, my knees weak, shivering violently. The street was emptier now. The music from below was a muffled thud, a heartbeat buried under the earth. I looked back at the open door, expecting to see the red pigtails emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty doorway and the faint rhythmic pulse of the bass. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the shaking. It was just a creep, I whispered to the empty street, my breath pluming in the air. Just a meth head in a stolen costume. He's not coming up, he's staying at the party. I turned toward campus, walking fast, my boots clicking loudly on the sidewalk. I told myself I was safe. I told myself the night was over. But then the wind shifted. It blew down the alleyway I was passing, carrying with it a faint, impossible scent, old grease, and underneath it the smell of something copper and raw. I stopped. The street was silent. Then from the darkness of the alley behind me I heard a sound. It wasn't music. It wasn't the wind. Click, click, click. It sounded like metal tapping against brick. Or perhaps a knife being dragged lovingly along a wall. I didn't look back. I started to run. The clicking sound didn't stop when I started running. It changed cadence, morphing from a leisurely tap into a rhythmic, heavy thud that seemed to sync perfectly with the frantic pounding of my own heart. I didn't look back immediately. There is a specific kind of cowardice that masquerades as survival instinct, a voice in the back of your lizard brain that insists if you don't acknowledge the monster, it remains a Schrodinger's cat, both there and not there, suspended in a state of quantum uncertainty. As long as I kept my eyes forward fixed on the distant flickering street lamps of Oak Creek, I could pretend the sound was just an echo, a loose manhole cover, or the settling of old buildings in the cooling night air. I turned the corner onto Elm Street, my boots skidding slightly on a patch of wet leaves. The street was a long, narrow artery lined with Victorian-era houses that had long since been converted into overpriced student apartments. Usually this street was alive on Halloween. Usually there would be porch parties, plastic skeletons hung from railings, and the smell of pumpkin spice and cheap beer. But tonight, the street was dead. The wind had picked up howling through the bare branches of the oak trees that gave the town its name, creating a cacophony of rustling and scraping that masked the world behind me. I slowed down to a brisk walk, my chest heaving. The cold air burned my throat. I pulled my phone out again, tapping the screen with trembling fingers. 1 bar of service, just one. I tried to open my messages to text Sarah to tell her I had left to ask if she was okay, but the screen froze the little loading wheel spinning in a mocking loop. Technology always fails in the dark. It's a trope for a reason. Signals die where fear begins. I shoved the useless brick back into my pocket and focused on my breathing. In for 4, out for 4. That was when I realized the silence had returned. The footsteps behind me had stopped. I paused under the pool of yellow light cast by a street lamp, its bulb buzzing with a dying electrical hum. I listened. Nothing but the wind and the distant wail of a siren miles away. Relief washed over me so potent it almost made my knees buckle. It was just an echo. I was paranoid. I had let a creepy guy in a costume get inside my head constructing a horror movie narrative out of a coincidental exit and a noisy street. Get a grip, Maya. I whispered, the steam from my breath swirling in the light. You're a sociology major, not a damsel in a slasher flick. Stop projecting. I adjusted my scarf and started walking again, my pace more measured, more confident. I took 3 steps. Thud, thud, thud. 3 heavy steps echoed behind me. I stopped. The steps stopped. My blood ran cold, losing all the warmth I had managed to salvage. This wasn't an echo. Echoes fade, they don't wait. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears against the wind. I lifted my right foot and brought it down hard against the pavement. Clack! From the darkness behind me, a single heavy stomp answered. It was mocking. It was a game. I didn't turn around. Not yet. I knew that if I turned and saw him, the game would change from hide-and-seek to tag, and I wasn't ready to be it. Instead, I started walking again faster this time. The footsteps matched me instantly. They didn't sound like sneakers or dress shoes. They sounded like heavy industrial work boots, the kind with steel toes and thick rubber soles designed to crush things. I needed to see him without him knowing I saw him. I needed confirmation before I started screaming and waking up the neighborhood. I scanned the street ahead. About 50 feet away on the right was a boutique clothing store called the Velvet Hanger. It was closed for the night, but I knew they kept a security light on in the window display. The glass was large, pristine, and angled slightly toward the street. It would work as a mirror. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, fighting the urge to sprint. If I ran, I admitted prey status. If I walked, I was just a girl going home. I kept my eyes fixed on the shop window as I approached it. The glass was dark, reflecting the street behind me like a black oil painting. I walked into the frame of the reflection, and then he entered it. The breath jammed in my throat. He wasn't half a block away as I had hoped. He was close. Terrifyingly close. Maybe 20 feet behind me. In the reflection under the sodium glare of the streetlights, he looked like a hallucination bleeding into reality. The blue dress was bright, almost luminescent against the gray pavement. The red pigtails bobbed with each heavy step he took, but it was his posture that terrified me. He wasn't walking like a normal person. His arms hung limp at his sides, swinging slightly with the momentum of his bulk, while his head was cocked to the side at a 45-degree angle, as if his neck was broken, or he was listening to a frequency only he could hear. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't hugging the shadows or ducking behind cars. He was walking right down the center of the sidewalk, claiming the space, marching with the entitlement of a king parading through a conquered city. And in his right hand, reflecting the street lamp above, was the object. It wasn't a plastic prop. It was a chef's knife, the blade at least 10 inches long, wide, and triangular. I saw the glint of the edge. It didn't look shiny and new. It looked dull, mottled with dark stains that the streetlights couldn't illuminate. He saw me looking. He must have seen my head turn toward the glass because in the reflection, he stopped. He raised the hand holding the knife and waved. It was a small, delicate wave using just his fingers, a gesture of grotesque intimacy. "I see you peeking, Patty." His voice drifted down the street. It wasn't a shout. It was a conversational tone carried by the wind, clear and distinct. "Do you like the view? Panic is a cold bucket of water. It clarifies things. It strips away the complex layers of social conditioning, the fear of making a scene, the fear of being rude, and leaves only the binary code of survival, run or die. I didn't scream. Screaming takes breath, and I needed every ounce of oxygen for my legs. I bolted. I abandoned the sidewalk and cut diagonally across the street, aiming for the gap between two parked cars. The sound of his boots changed instantly. No more slow, mocking thuds. Now it was a rapid, drumming thunder. He was running. And for a man of his size, encased in layers of fat and fabric, he was impossibly fast. "Don't run!" he roared, the voice cracking into something feral. "Fast food isn't supposed to run!" I hit the opposite sidewalk and sprinted toward the intersection of Elm and 4th. My dorm, Davison Hall, was 4 blocks away. But to get there, I had to pass the commercial district, which would be empty, or cut through Memorial Park. The park was shorter, but the park was dark. "Think, Maya, think," I chanted internally, the rhythm of my feet slapping the pavement, keeping time with my thoughts. The police station was on the other side of town. The campus security booths were scattered, and half of them were broken, their blue lights burnt out years ago. I reached the intersection. The light was red, but there were no cars. I didn't pause. I scrambled across the asphalt, my lungs burning as if I had inhaled broken glass. I could hear him behind me. He wasn't winded, he was laughing. A wet, gurgling chuckle that sounded like water draining from a clogged sink. "You're making the meat tough, Patty. Stress ruins the flavor." I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was gaining. He moved like a landslide, a chaotic tumble of blue and red that seemed to devour the distance between us. The knife was no longer at his side. He held it raised, the blade pointing forward like a compass needle seeking north. I made a split decision. I couldn't outrun him on the straightaway. His strides were too long. I needed obstacles. I needed terrain. I veered left, darting into the alleyway behind the old cinema. It was narrow-lined with dumpsters and stacks of wooden pallets. It was a risk, alleys or dead-ends traps. But I knew this one connected to the back of the student union parking lot. I crashed into a stack of cardboard boxes, sending them tumbling into his path. I heard him plow through them a second later, the sound of cardboard tearing and boots stomping. "Messy girl, see." "Oh," he taunted, closer now. "I'll have to clean you up before I peel you." The threat was specific. Peel, not kill, not hurt. Peel. The word lodged in my brain like a splinter. It implied preparation. It implied a process. It confirmed what my instincts had screamed in the basement. This wasn't a murder. It was a harvest. I burst out of the alley and into the parking lot. It was a sea of asphalt, illuminated by flickering floodlights. It was empty, save for a few faculty cars. I sprinted toward the far end, toward the chain-link fence that separated the lot from the wooded edge of Memorial Park. There was a gap in the fence. Every student knew about it. It was the shortcut we used to get to late-night study sessions or parties. I squeezed through the opening, the jagged metal snagging my jacket, tearing the sleeve. I didn't care. I ripped free and stumbled onto the grass of the park. Memorial Park was a sprawling darkness in the center of the town. During the day it was beautiful oak trees, picnic benches, a duck pond. At night it was a black void. The streetlights from the parking lot didn't penetrate the tree line. I ran into the trees. The ground was uneven here, riddled with roots and fallen branches. I stumbled, catching myself on a rough trunk, scraping my palms raw. It was pitch black. I was blind. I stopped pressing my back against a large oak tree, trying to silence my breathing. I clamped both hands over my mouth, my chest convulsing. I needed to know if he had followed me through the fence. Maybe he was too big. Maybe he got stuck. Silence descended on the woods. The wind rustled the dry leaves above, sounding like 1,000 whispering voices. I waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then I heard it. Click. It came from the path to my right. Click. It came from the path to my left. He wasn't just following me. He was hunting. He had moved off the paved path and was walking through the brush, the dry leaves crunching under his weight with deliberate slowness. Patty. His voice floated through the trees. It didn't sound like it came from one direction. It sounded like it was everywhere, bouncing off the trunks. I know you're in the pantry. I can smell the adrenaline. It smells like copper. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking out hot and fast. He was right. I reeked of fear. I was broadcasting my location with every pheromone my body released. I needed to move. Standing still was death. I knew the layout of the park. If I cut straight through the dense brush, I would come out on University Avenue right in front of the 24-hour diner. There would be people there. Light. Witnesses. I pushed off the tree, moving as quietly as I could. I stepped high, trying to avoid crunching the leaves, placing my feet with agonizing care. Snap. A twig broke under my boot. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in a library. Immediately, the slow crunching to my left stopped. "Found you," he whispered. He wasn't far away. He was right behind the tree next to me. I didn't think. I lunged forward, abandoning stealth. I sprinted blindly into the dark, my hands outstretched to deflect branches that whipped at my face. And then the light hit me. Not the warm glow of a diner. A harsh, blinding beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, pinning me like a moth on a board. It didn't come from the street. It came from him. He had a flashlight. Of course he had a flashlight. He was prepared. The beam blinded me, destroying my night vision. I stumbled my foot, catching on a hidden root. The world tilted. I slammed into the ground hard, the air driven from my lungs with a wet whoomp. The taste of dirt and dead leaves filled my mouth. I tried to scramble up, but a heavy weight slammed down onto my calf. A boot. I screamed then. A raw, animalistic sound that tore my throat. "Hush now!" The voice came from above the blinding light. "Don't bruise the goods!" I kicked out with my free leg, connecting with something solid. He grunted but didn't let go. I clawed at the dirt, dragging myself forward, but he was an anchor. "Please," I begged, the word tasting of bile. "Please, just take my wallet. Take my phone." The light shifted. I looked back, squinting against the glare. I couldn't see his face, just the silhouette of the wig's pigtails and the massive bulk of his shoulders against the stars. He leaned down, and the smell of old grease and rot washed over me, a tidal wave of filth. "I don't want your money, Patty," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming serious, almost professional. "I have a quota to fill. The shift doesn't end until the freezer is full." He reached down. I saw the glint of the knife in the flashlight's beam. He wasn't stabbing me. He was reaching for my shirt, grabbing the fabric to drag me. I wasn't going to die here. I wasn't going to be a headline. I wasn't going to be a story told at parties about the girl who vanished in the park. My hand brushed against a rock, a jagged, fist-sized stone half buried in the dirt. My fingers closed around it. It felt cold, solid, a piece of the earth that wasn't afraid. As he yanked me backward, pulling me toward him, I spun my body. I didn't aim. I just swung the rock with every ounce of terror and rage I possessed, swinging it toward the darkness where his face should be. Crack! The sound of stone hitting bone was sickeningly wet. He roared, a sound of genuine pain this time. The weight on my leg vanished as he stumbled back, the flashlight beam swinging wildly through the trees, illuminating branches, sky ground, then his own face for a split second. I saw blood. Real blood, dark and flowing, streaming from his nose, mixing with the white grease paint and the fake red smile. His eyes were wide, shocked. He touched his face, looking at his fingers. "You chipped the merchandise," he bellowed, spitting a tooth onto the leaves. "Bad Patty bayed." I scrambled to my feet. I didn't look to see if he was falling. I ran. I ran toward the distant glow of streetlights that marked the edge of the park. "I'm going to carve that defiance out of you," he screamed after me. I burst out of the tree line and onto the sidewalk of University Avenue. The sudden transition from the soft forest floor to concrete jarred my spine. I was sobbing openly now, gasping for air. The street was empty. The diner across the street was dark. The open 24 hours sign was flickering, the O burnt out. Pen 24 hours? It looked abandoned. "No," I whimpered. "No, no, no." I looked down the long, empty road. No cars, no police. Just the wind blowing trash along the gutters. And from the woods behind me, the heavy rhythmic thudding began again, faster, angrier, thump, thump, thump. He wasn't walking anymore. He was charging. I saw a phone booth on the corner, a relic, a dinosaur of communication standing lonely under a street lamp. I sprinted toward it not to make a call, but because it had a door, a barrier, anything. I threw myself inside the glass booth and slammed the folding door shut. I jammed my body against it. It was flimsy. It wouldn't hold him, but it was all I had. I looked back at the park. The trees were shaking. Something massive was tearing through the brush, ignoring the path, smashing through branches and bushes like a tank. The mascot burst from the tree line. He didn't look human anymore. The wig was askew, hanging off one side of his head. His face was a mask of blood and smeared paint. The dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a hairy, pale shoulder. He stopped at the curb, panting, steam rising from his body in the cold air. He saw me in the booth. He raised the knife. He pointed it at me. Then he pointed the knife at his own eye, mimicking the injury I had given him. He stepped onto the road. "Ordering is closed," he shouted, his voice echoing off the silent buildings. "Time for the slaughter." He began to run toward the booth. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed, waiting for the glass to shatter. But the shattering sound didn't come from the booth. It came from above. A street lamp directly over him exploded. Sparks showered down in a cascade of blue and white fire. He flinched, shielding his eyes. In that split second of distraction, headlights swept around the corner, a campus security cruiser. The mascot looked at the car, then at me. He didn't flee immediately. He hesitated. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hate. He licked the blood running down from his nose. "Rain check, Patty," he mouthed. Then he turned and vanished back into the darkness of the woods, disappearing as if the shadows themselves had swallowed him whole. The security car screeched to a halt. A heavy-set guard climbed out, flashlight in hand. "Hey, you okay in there?" I couldn't answer. I slid down the glass wall of the booth, hitting the metal floor. I stared at the dark tree line. I knew he was gone, but I also knew with a certainty that settled in my marrow like ice that he hadn't left. He was just waiting for the lights to go out again. I looked down at my hand. I was still clutching the rock. It was covered in grease paint and blood. It was the only thing that felt real, the only proof that I hadn't just lost my mind. I dropped the rock. It hit the floor of the booth. Click. The sound was identical to his footsteps. I screamed. The safety of the campus security cruiser was an illusion constructed of vinyl seats and the smell of stale Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Officer Miller, a man whose uniform strained against a stomach built by years of sedentary night shifts, didn't turn on the siren. He didn't call for backup. He simply drove with one hand on the wheel, the other adjusting the rearview mirror to glance at me with a mixture of pity and skepticism that felt like a slap in the face. "You're sure it wasn't just a frat pledge, hun?" Miller asked, his voice gravelly and tired. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield, clearing away a sudden drizzle that had begun to fall, smearing the streetlights into long, weeping streaks of amber. "The Delta boys, they do this Hell Week thing. Dress up, chase the freshmen. It's stupid, but it's usually harmless." I stared out the window, watching the darkened campus roll by. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, trembling hollow in my chest. My hands were still shaking, the knuckles white where I gripped the door handle. "He had a knife." I whispered the words, scraping against my raw throat. "A real knife, and he smelled like rot, like old meat." Miller sighed a sound of long-suffering patience. "I believe you were scared. But shadows play tricks in the woods, and that blood on your jacket could be fake. Corn syrup and red dye looks mighty real in the dark." He didn't see the chip in the mascot's tooth. He didn't feel the weight of the boot on my leg. He was rewriting my trauma into a manageable anecdote, filing it under Halloween prank before the paperwork even touched his desk. I stopped talking. There is no language for horror that translates to the bureaucratic mind. To him, I was just a hysterical girl who had spooked herself in the park. He pulled up to the curb in front of Davison Hall. The dormitory was a brutalist slab of concrete and narrow windows, looking less like a home and more like a minimum security prison. It was usually buzzing with activity, but tonight the windows were dark. Everyone was out. Everyone was at the parties, at the bars, anywhere but here. "You got your key card?" Miller asked, keeping the engine running. I nodded, patting my pocket. "Yeah." "All right. Lock your door. Take a hot shower. You'll feel better in the morning." He waited until I stepped out onto the wet pavement, watched me walk to the heavy glass doors, and then with a casual wave he pulled away. The taillights of the cruiser vanished around the corner, taking my only lifeline with them. I stood alone in the foyer of Davison Hall. The silence of the building was heavier than the noise of the club had been. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I swiped my card. The reader beeped a cheerful electronic chirp that sounded obscene in the quiet, and the lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. I stepped inside. The lobby was empty. The vending machines hummed in the corner, their lights casting long, flickering shadows across the linoleum floor. I walked toward the elevators, my boots squeaking on the polished tile. I pressed the button for the 4th floor. The elevator ride was agonizing. The mirrored walls reflected a version of myself I barely recognized. My hair was matted with leaves and sweat. My face was streaked with dirt. My jacket was torn. I looked like a survivor of a war zone standing in a metal box that smelled of lemon disinfectant. Ding. The doors slid open. The 4th floor hallway stretched out before me, a long tunnel of beige carpet and closed doors. It was dimly lit, half the fluorescent tubes switched off for the night to save power. I stepped out the elevator doors, closing behind me with a finality that made me flinch. I needed to wash. I needed to scrub the sensation of his hand off my ankle. I needed to get the smell of grease out of my nostrils before I could even think about sleeping. My room was at the end of the hall, 404, but the communal bathroom was closer, just to the left. I pushed open the bathroom door. It was a large, sterile room with a row of sinks on one side and stalls on the other. It was empty. The air here was cold, smelling of bleach and damp towels. I walked to the sink, turning on the tap. The water sputtered, then flowed clear and cold. I splashed water on my face, scrubbing hard. I grabbed a paper towel from the dispenser, the rough texture scraping my skin. I looked up at the mirror. My eyes were wide, the pupils dilated so much they eclipsed the irises. I leaned in closer, inspecting a scratch on my cheek from a branch. And then I heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sound of the main door at the end of the hallway opening, the heavy fire door that required a key card. Squeak, thud. I froze, water dripping from my chin onto the porcelain. Maybe it's Sarah, I thought. Maybe it's a roommate coming home early. I turned off the tap. The silence rushed back in, amplified. Clomp, clomp, clomp. The steps were heavy, slow, deliberate. They weren't the scuffing sounds of sneakers or the click of heels. They were the flat, heavy impacts of work boots. The same boots that had crushed the leaves in the park. My breath hitched. Impossible. I had swiped my card. The door locked automatically. Unless someone had caught the door before it closed, or unless he had a card. No, I whispered, backing away from the sink. He can't be here. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. I saw the shadow of feet under the gap of the door. Large, dark shapes blocking the hallway light. Knock, knock. A voice crooned from the other side. It was muffled by the wood, but the timbre was unmistakable. It was the sound of gravel grinding in a blender. Housekeeping. He hadn't vanished. He hadn't run away. He had followed the cruiser. He had watched me enter. He had hunted me to my sanctuary. I looked around the bathroom frantically. There was no window, no second exit, just the stalls and the showers. A trap. A tiled, sterile slaughterhouse. The door handle jiggled. Locked. No, it was a communal bathroom. It didn't lock. The handle turned. I scrambled backward, rushing into the last stall in the row. I slammed the flimsy metal door and slid the bolt shut. It was a pathetic barrier, a piece of tin against a monster. I climbed up onto the toilet seat, crouching, pulling my knees to my chest, praying he wouldn't see my feet. The bathroom door creaked open. The change in air pressure was palpable. The smell drifted in instantly, overpowering the bleach. That sickening, cloying scent of fryer grease and unwashed body. Clomp. He stepped onto the tile. "Patty!" He called out, his voice echoing off the ceramic walls. "I know you're in here. I heard the water. You're trying to clean yourself up. That's good. Hygiene is important in food preparation." I pressed my hands over my mouth, tears streaming hot and fast down my face. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he must hear it. Thump, 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 thump. He walked past the sinks. I heard his hand trailing along the countertop, knocking over a bottle of soap. Thud. "You know," he mused, his voice getting closer, "you made me drop my knife in the woods. That was rude, but lucky for me, I heard a metallic shing sound. A different sound. This place is full of tools. I found a lovely pair of scissors at the front desk. The RA was asleep, very deeply asleep." My stomach turned over. The RA, Mrs. Gable. She sat at the front desk on weekends. He stopped in front of the first stall. Bang! He kicked the door open. It crashed against the divider. "Not here," he sang. He moved to the second stall. Bang! Not here either. There were 5 stalls. I was in the 5th. He was taking his time. He was savoring the countdown. This was the theater of the hunt, and he was the star performer. 3rd stall. Bang! I looked around desperately. The ceiling tiled, the walls cinder block, the toilet tank, heavy ceramic lid. I grabbed the lid of the toilet tank. It was heavy, cold, and slippery with condensation. I lifted it off my muscles, straining to keep it from clinking against the porcelain. I held it to my chest like a shield, like a weapon. 4th stall, bang, getting warmer, he whispered. He was right next to me now. I could hear his breathing, wheezing, wet, congested. I could hear the rustle of that synthetic blue dress. He stopped in front of my stall. He didn't kick it immediately. He leaned against it. I saw his fingers curl over the top of the door. Thick, hairy fingers with dirt under the nails. "Found you," he whispered. He didn't kick the door. He reached up, grabbed the top of the frame, and pulled himself up to peer over. His face appeared above the door. It was a nightmare in high definition. The grease paint was smeared with brown blood from his nose. His lip was split. The red wig was gone, revealing a scalp that was bald in patches covered in sores. But his eyes were bright with a terrible, focused joy. Peekaboo, he grinned. I screamed. I didn't think, I just reacted. I thrust the heavy ceramic tank lid upward with all my strength, aiming for his face. He saw it coming and jerked his head back, but not fast enough. The lid clipped his chin with a bone-jarring crack. He roared in pain and dropped back down to the floor. "You little bitch," he screamed, the playful facade vanishing instantly. "I'm going to fillet you." He threw his weight against the door. The bolt bent. The metal groaned. I didn't wait for the second hit. I unlocked the door and kicked it open outward before he could ram it again. It hit him in the face, staggering him. I leaped out of the stall. He was stumbling back, clutching his jaw, the scissors, long silver shears clutched in his other hand. I ran for the door. The tiles were slippery with water from the sinks. I skidded, almost falling, my hand slapping the wet floor to steady myself. "Get back here!" he bellowed. I burst into the hallway. The elevator was too slow. The stairs. I had to get to the stairs. I sprinted down the carpeted hall. Behind me, the bathroom door slammed open. I heard him running. He was faster on the carpet. No slipping. I reached the stairwell door. I shoved the push bar. It was locked. What then? I remembered. The stairwells in Davison were alarmed and locked from the inside at night to prevent people from letting guests in. You could go down, but you needed a key to open it from the hall side. No weight that was backwards. You could exit. Why wouldn't it open? I shoved again. It was jammed. Or maybe I was just too weak from panic. I turned around. He was 20 feet away. He stopped running when he saw me trapped. He straightened up, adjusting the torn strap of his dress. He wiped the blood from his chin and licked it off his fingers. "End of the line, Patty," he said, breathing hard. He began to walk toward me, tapping the scissors against his thigh. Click, click, click. I backed up until my spine hit the cold metal of the door. There was nowhere to go. To my right, a dead end. To my left, him. "Why?" I sobbed, the question bursting out of me. "Why are you doing this?" He paused, tilting his head. "Because you're ripe," he said simply, as if explaining gravity. "And because it's Halloween. Everyone wears a mask. I'm just showing you what's underneath." He lunged. I tried to dodge, but he was too big. He slammed me against the door, his body weight crushing the air from my lungs. The smell was suffocating. He pinned my left arm with his body. His right hand brought the scissors up. I grabbed his wrist with my free hand. We struggled. He was impossibly strong. The scissors inching closer to my eye. "Hold still," he grunted, saliva spraying my face. "Precision is key." I couldn't hold his arm back. I felt my strength failing. The silver point hovered inches from my pupil. "No," I gasped. He shifted his grip. He didn't stab my eye. He dragged the point down, hard. The blade bit into my cheek just below the eye and tore downwards to my jawline. The pain was blinding. It wasn't a sharp cut. It was a tearing sensation, hot and searing like a brand. I screamed a sound that tore my throat raw. "There," he whispered, staring at the wound with fascination. "Marked. Now I can find you anywhere. You're part of the menu." The pain gave me a surge of hysterical strength. I did the only thing I could think of. I bit him. I sank my teeth into the meaty part of his hand holding the scissors. I bit until I tasted copper. He howled and yanked his hand back. The scissors clattered to the floor. I dropped to the ground, scrambling between his legs. I grabbed the scissors. He turned enraged. He raised his boot to stomp on me. I thrust the scissors upward. I didn't know where I was aiming. I just stabbed. The blade sank into his thigh, deep into the muscle. He screamed a high-pitched feminine shriek that didn't match his bulk. He staggered back, clutching his leg. I didn't wait to see the damage. I scrambled up and ran toward my room, 404. It was only 10 feet away. I fumbled for my key card. My hands were slick with his blood and mine. "Come on, come on." I heard him limping behind me, dragging the injured leg. "I'm going to eat your heart," he roared. I swiped the card. Green light. I threw the door open and fell inside. I slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt, then the chain, then I dragged my desk chair under the knob. Bam! His body hit the door a second later. The wood splintered around the frame, but it held. Bam! "Open up!" he screamed. "I forgot the dessert!" I backed away, crawling into the corner of the room, clutching the bloody scissors. I couldn't see out of my left eye. The blood from my cheek was blinding me. Bam! Then silence. I waited. The only sound was my own jagged breathing and the drip of blood onto the floor. "Maya," a voice from the hallway, not him. "Maya, is that you? What's going on?" It was the guy from 402, David. "David, call the police," I screamed. "He's in the hall. He's got a knife." "Who?" "There's nobody here," David yelled back. I froze. "What?" I heard screaming. I came out. The hall is empty, Maya. But, Jesus, there's blood everywhere. I crawled to the window. I looked down. 4 stories down in the darkness of the parking lot, a figure was limping away toward the tree line. He was dragging one leg. He stopped under a streetlight. He looked up. He couldn't see me in the dark room, but he looked right at my window. He raised his hand to his cheek and traced a line down it. Then he waved. Sirens wailed in the distance. Real sirens this time, a lot of them. I touched my face. My fingers came away wet and warm. The cut was deep. It would scar. It would never go away. He was gone, but he had left his receipt etched into my skin. I slumped against the wall, the scissors slipping from my numb fingers. The room felt small. The door felt thin. And for the first time, I understood that locks were just suggestions to monsters like him. The pain in my cheek throbbed in time with my pulse, a constant burning reminder I survived the appetizer. But the kitchen never closes. I closed my eyes, but the darkness was worse. In the dark, I could still smell the grease. And I knew with the certainty of the damn that somewhere in the night he was licking the blade clean. The blue lights of the police cruisers didn't make me feel safe. They just made the blood on my hands look purple. I sat on the edge of an ambulance gurney, wrapped in a shock blanket that smelled of industrial detergent, shivering violently, despite the sweat drying on my skin. The paramedic, a woman with kind eyes and hands that moved with clinical detachment, was stitching my face. Every pull of the thread was a sharp, stinging reminder of the scissors, a physical punctuation mark to the sentence I survived. "It's a deep laceration," she murmured, her voice low, to avoid being overheard by the cluster of officers nearby. "But it missed the facial nerve. You were lucky." Lucky. That word felt like a stone in my stomach. Lucky was winning a scratch-off ticket. Lucky was finding a $20 bill in an old coat. Lucky wasn't having your cheek sliced open by a cannibal in a Mascot costume in a university bathroom. I watched the police work. They were swarming Davison Hall now, flashlights cutting through the dark windows, dogs barking as they swept the tree line. Officer Miller was talking to a detective in a cheap suit. I saw Miller gesture to the woods, then to the phone booth, then to me. The detective looked bored. He wrote something in a notebook, snapped it shut, and walked over to me. "Miss." He didn't introduce himself. "We found a wig, red synthetic fiber, and some blood on the bathroom floor that isn't yours. We're sending it to the lab." "Did you find him?" I asked, my jaw stiff from the anesthetic. "We have K9 units in the woods," he said, avoiding my eyes. "But there's a lot of ground out there, and the rain, it washes away tracks." He didn't have to finish the sentence. I knew what he meant. The rain was washing away the evidence. The rain was helping him. "He said he wanted to peel me," I whispered. The detective paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of unease behind his professional mask. "We'll issue a bolo. Be on the lookout. A man in a blue dress, hard to miss." But he was hard to miss. That was the problem. He was a neon sign in a dark room, a grotesque absurdity, and yet he had moved through the town like smoke. He had walked down Main Street. He had entered a secure dorm. He had vanished into thin air. The next few weeks were a blur of pain pills, police statements, and a fear so profound it felt like a chronic illness. I couldn't stay in Davison Hall. Every time I looked at the bathroom door, I saw the dent where he had kicked it. Every time I heard a heavy footstep in the hall, my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I dropped my classes. I stopped eating because everything tasted like grease. The university, terrified of a lawsuit, expedited a transfer. They moved me to the Fortress, student slang for North Tower, the newest, most secure dormitory on campus. It was a sterile high-rise building with key-card access at every door, security cameras in every hallway, and a 24-hour guard at the front desk who actually stayed awake. My new room was on the 12th floor, room 1208. It was a small concrete box with a window that only opened 3 inches, a suicide prevention measure that now felt like a blessing. I felt safer there. It was a fortress in the sky, far away from the dark woods and the damp earth. I developed rituals. I checked the lock on my door 5 times before bed. I pushed my dresser in front of the door every night. I bought a jammer for the handle. I taped over the webcam on my laptop. I stopped going out after sunset. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the library during the day and barricading myself in my tower at night. The police investigation hit a wall. The blood they found belonged to an unknown male. No matches in CODIS, no matches in the local database. The wig was a generic brand sold at every party store in America. The fingerprints I claimed were on the toilet tank lid were smudged useless by the struggle. "It's likely a transient," the detective told me over the phone, his voice sounding tinny and distant. "Someone passing through. These types, they don't stay in one place. He's probably 3 states away by now." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that the Mascot was just a nightmare that had moved on to haunt someone else. And for a while, the silence of the 12th floor convinced me. But then the gifts started arriving. It began with the flyers. 3 weeks after the attack, I came back from a morning lecture to find a piece of paper slipped under my door. It was a standard promotional flyer for Wendy's. 2 for $5 deal, limited time only. I stared at it, lying on the gray carpet like an innocent piece of trash. My hands started to shake. I picked it up with the tips of my fingers. It looked normal, glossy paper, pictures of burgers and nuggets. I opened my door and looked into the hallway. Empty. The camera at the end of the hall stared back at me, its red light blinking steadily. I went to the front desk. The guard, a burly man named Rick, pulled up the footage. We watched the screen together. "See?" Rick pointed at the timestamp. 10:14 a.m. That's the delivery guy. We let them leave menus sometimes. On the screen, a young guy in a hoodie was walking down the hall, shoving flyers under every door. It was mundane. It was normal. "It's just junk mail, Maya," Rick said gently. "I can tell them to stop if it bothers you." "Please," I said, my voice tight. "No fast food flyers." I threw the flyer away, but the smell lingered on my fingers. Not the smell of paper, the smell of old oil. 2 days later, another flyer appeared. This one wasn't under the door, it was taped to the outside of my window. I stood in the center of my room staring at the glass. I was on the 12th floor. There was no balcony. The window was a sheer drop to the concrete plaza below. The flyer was facing inward. It was a picture of a Frosty. But someone had taken a red marker and drawn a sad face on the cup. I called Rick. He came up, his face pale. He opened the window the 3 inches it allowed and peeled the flyer off. "How?" he stammered, looking down at the dizzying drop. Maybe the wind blew it up here and it got stuck." "It was taped, Rick," I said, pointing to the residue on the glass. "Wind doesn't use Scotch tape." He checked the roof access, locked. He checked the window washing rig. It hadn't been used in months. I'll file a report," Rick said, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't have an explanation. And when authority figures run out of explanations, that's when you know you're on your own. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my room, clutching the scissors I had stolen from the art supply room, a heavier, sharper pair than the ones I had used before. I listened to the wind howling around the tower. It sounded like voices. It sounded like laughter. The psychological warfare escalated. It wasn't just flyers anymore. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the smell, that thick, cloying stench of rancid grease. It would fill the room, choking me, making me gag. I would jump up, turn on the lights, and search everywhere. Under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. I stripped the sheets. I scrubbed the walls with bleach until my hands were raw. But the smell would return, drifting in from nowhere, heavy and suffocating. Phantom smells, the campus counselor told me. Olfactory hallucinations. It's a common symptom of PTSD. Your brain is recreating the trauma. I'm not crazy, I snapped at her. I know what I smell. I'm not saying you're crazy, Maya. I'm saying you're hurt. The mind tries to make sense of fear by replaying it. She prescribed me sleeping pills, Ambien. She said I needed to rest, that the sleep deprivation was making the paranoia worse. I took the pills. I had to. I was falling apart. And that brings us to tonight. It's raining again, a heavy, relentless downpour that lashes against the window pane like handfuls of gravel. The wind is screaming around the corners of the north tower, making the whole building groan. I took my Ambien an hour ago. My body feels heavy like it's filled with lead, but my mind is still racing, fighting the chemical fog. I decided to study. I have a midterm in ethics tomorrow. The irony isn't lost on me. Studying moral philosophy while hiding from a monster who has none. I sat at my desk, the lamp casting a small pool of warm light in the dark room. I opened my textbook, The Foundations of Moral Duty. I had left a bookmark in chapter 4. I flipped the book open. My heart stopped. Pressed between pages 104 and 105 was not my bookmark. It was a napkin, a white, crinkled Wendy's napkin. It was flattened out, pressed neatly between the pages. In the center of the napkin was a stain, a dark brownish-red stain that had soaked through the paper fibers. It was dried blood, and drawn in the center of the blood stain with a black marker was a smile. That same jagged, unnatural smile he wore on his face. Below the smile, written in tiny, neat letters that looked like they belonged to a diligent student, were the words, "Found you, Patty." I stared at the napkin, the world tilted on its axis. I hadn't opened this book in 2 days. It had been sitting on my desk. My door was locked, my dresser was in front of it, the jammer was in place, the window was locked. How the question screamed in my mind, piercing through the fog of the Ambien. How did he get in? I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the floor. I backed away from the desk, my eyes darting around the room. The door, still blocked. The window, still shut. The closet. I checked it 10 minutes ago. Empty. Then the smell hit me. Stronger than ever before. It wasn't a phantom smell. It was real. It was thick, hot, and nauseating. It smelled of onions sizzling and old lard. It smelled of unwashed skin and damp fabric. It wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from the window. I looked up. Above my desk in the drop ceiling of the dorm room was a vent, a standard square HVAC vent painted white to blend in with the acoustic tiles. I stared at it. One of the screws in the corner of the vent cover was missing. Another screw was loose, hanging by a thread. And sticking out of the slats of the vent, fluttering slightly in the air current, was a single strand of bright synthetic red hair. My blood froze into slush. He wasn't outside. He wasn't climbing the walls like Spider-Man. He wasn't hacking the key card system. He was in the building. He was in the infrastructure. The North Tower was new, but it had massive industrial air ducts to handle the heating and cooling for a high-rise. Ducts big enough for a man, even a large man, to crawl through. He had been living in the ceiling. He had been crawling over my head while I slept. He had been watching me through the slats of the vent while I changed. He had waited until I went to the bathroom or the library to drop down, slip the note in my book, and climb back up. He was the monster under the bed, but he had upgraded to the penthouse. I backed away toward the door, my hands fumbling to pull the dresser away. I had to get out. I had to get to Rick. Click. The sound came from above. I froze. Click. The sound of metal tapping against metal. The sound of a knife blade gently tapping the inside of the vent duct. going somewhere, Patty." The voice didn't come from the vent. It came from everywhere. The acoustics of the metal ductwork amplified it, turning his gravelly whisper into a surround sound nightmare. I called the police. I lied, my voice shaking. They're on their way." A low, wet chuckle reverberated through the ceiling tiles. "Police look at the ground, sweetie. They look at footprints. They don't look up." Nobody looks up. The vent cover above my desk rattled. The loose screw fell. It hit my desk with a tiny ping that sounded like a gong. "You changed rooms," the voice continued, conversational, intimate. "You moved up high. You thought you were Rapunzel in her tower. But you forgot one thing." The vent cover shifted. Fingers appeared through the slats. Those thick, sausage-like fingers. Rats like high places, too. I screamed and threw my weight against the dresser, shoving it aside. The heavy wood screeched across the floor. "Too slow," he sang. The vent cover crashed down onto my desk. I looked back. A head was hanging upside down from the hole in the ceiling. It was him. But he looked worse. So much worse. The grease paint was gone, replaced by a layer of gray dust and grime from the ducts. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow. The cut I'd given him on his leg must have infected him, or maybe living in the vents was taking its toll. But the smile was the same. He had repainted it with fresh lipstick, bright crimson against the filth. And the scar I'd given him with the rock. It ran from his eyebrow to his ear, a jagged, angry purple line that mirrored the one on my own cheek. We were twins now, marked by the same violence. "Dinner time!" he screeched. He didn't drop down, he reached down. His arms were impossibly long. He swung a meat cleaver, a rusted, heavy thing, at me. It missed my head by an inch, slicing through the lampshade on my desk. I tore at the locks on my door, the jammer, the deadbolt, the chain. My fingers were fumbling, slippery with sweat. "Come back!" he yelled, struggling to squeeze his massive shoulders through the opening. "I have a new recipe. It calls for fresh ingredients." I got the door open. I threw myself into the hallway, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Rick, help! He's here!" I ran down the hallway, toward the elevators. Behind me, I heard a heavy thump as he finally dislodged himself from the ceiling and hit the floor of my room. "Run, Patty, run," he howled, his voice booming down the corridor. "Marinate the meat with fear." I reached the elevator. I smashed the button. Ding! The doors opened instantly. Thank God. I threw myself inside and hit the lobby button. As the doors began to slide shut, I saw him. He burst out of my room. He was limping heavily, his leg dragging, but he was moving with a manic, terrifying energy. He was covered in gray dust, looking like a golem made of lint and hate. He raised the cleaver. The doors closed just as he reached them. Thud. The impact shook the elevator car. I slumped against the wall as the elevator began to descend. I watched the numbers count down. 11, 10, 9. I was safe. I was going to the lobby. Rick was there. The police would come. They would trap him on the 12th floor. But then, as the elevator passed the 7th floor, I heard a sound that stopped my heart forever. Above me, on the roof of the elevator car. Thump. He hadn't stayed on the 12th floor. He had pried the doors open. He had jumped onto the top of the car. I looked up at the ceiling of the elevator. There was a trap door, an emergency hatch. Scrape, the sound of metal on metal. He was prying the hatch open. I backed into the corner, clutching the scissors I had carried with me. The hatch lifted. A hand reached down, a hand holding a cleaver. "Did you know," his voice echoed in the small metal box, distorted and booming, "that these shafts connect to the basement? We're going down, Patty, down to where the real kitchen is." The elevator jolted. He wasn't just riding it. He was cutting the cables. The lights flickered. Gravity lurched. And as the car began to freefall, plunging me into darkness with the monster on the roof, I realized the truth. The warning I should have seen from the start. You can lock the doors, you can bar the windows, you can move to the highest tower, but you can't build a fortress against something that lives in the walls. You can't hide from a hunger that knows your scent. The last thing I saw before the emergency brakes failed and the world dissolved into screaming metal and darkness was his face peering down through the hatch illuminated by sparks. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was opening his mouth. And it was wide enough to swallow me whole. Police report excerpt. Case hash 899-21. Incident North Tower elevator failure. Missing person status. Open. Unsolved notes. The body of Maya, redacted, was never recovered from the elevator shaft. When rescue teams accessed the car at the sub-basement level, the hatch was open. The car was empty. Forensic analysis of the shaft discovered a makeshift tunnel broken through the concrete foundation wall leading into the abandoned steam tunnels that run beneath the university and connect to the old industrial district. Inside the tunnel, investigators found a single object, a Wendy's napkin. Written on it in red marker were the words, "The customer has been served." To anyone reading this, if you hear tapping in your walls, if you smell grease when you haven't been cooking, if you find a flyer where it shouldn't be, don't check the lock, check the vent, because he's still hungry. And the shift never ends.